those. So the first half of this presentation will be kind of what the status quo has been up until now with the federal credit and the state credit from 1990. And then we'll delve in a little more about what the new credit is and what it does and the improvements that we were able to make by passing this new law. So let's jump in with just how these programs work. So there are federal and state level credits. The federal credit has been around since 1978, and ours was first established in 1990. It's one of the oldest state tax credit programs for historic preservation in the country. New Mexico does have us beat, but I think we are second place. Nothing wrong with second.
You know, Stephanie loves New Mexico being first.
No, I like Colorado being first.
One of the biggest differences between the two is that the federal credit has always been, including its name, the Federal Investment Tax Credit, and the focus of that credit has always been to encourage investment, financial investment in historic properties, particularly for commercial, and that's why the federal credit is actually only available to income-producing properties, commercial properties, and rental units, because it's designed as an economic development tool first and foremost, whereas the state tax credit, as it says in the title, is for historic preservation, and the goal of the state tax credit is more to promote the preservation and reuse of historic buildings for whatever use, even if it's a private home that doesn't really make that much money for anybody. Maybe the property taxes go up by a bit. Not a whole lot of economic development traditionally associated with homeowner redevelopment, and our focus is more just to have these neighborhoods fixed up and that they don't run down or get demolished. So let's jump into how these programs work. The idea behind all of them is to do rehabilitation. And so here I've got a definition of rehabilitation and what it actually does. The idea behind this is that if you have a building, you might need to make some changes to it to make it into a new use if you can't keep the original use. But if you're going to make those changes, then you want to do it in a way that keeps the historic characteristics of the building inside and out, where people can still recognize that the building is historic. So for example, this was a fire station. This is also in New Mexico. Turned into a restaurant, and you can see that even though the use is totally different, it is a renovation project, a rehabilitation project that kept all the features on the outside that made the building historic. So a person can come by and still recognize this building architecturally the same as it was before. They didn't have to make that many changes, and actually even on the inside, the features that made it a great fire station with the open floor plans for fire trucks and firemen's barracks also work really well for a restaurant, which also has big open floor spaces for tables and diners and kitchens. So they did have to make some changes to the property, but overall those changes were well-fitting within the shell of the building that they had to work with. So a tax credit is a direct reduction. That's a big thing because most of the incentives that are offered by the government come in the form of deductions where you knock something off of your income, you make X amount per year, and you use those deductions to knock down that income a bit. And that generally results in, whether how much you pay in taxes, anywhere from 20 to 30 cents on the dollars. For every dollar of a deduction you get, you really only save about 30 cents. Whereas a tax credit is a dollar per dollar reduction. So if you have a dollar in credit, that knocks a full dollar off of what you owe to the feds or to the state. The credits generally equal 10 or 20% of the project costs. We'll get into that in a little bit. And so just basic math, if you did a $100,000 project, you get $20,000 in tax credits. Keep in mind that these tax credits can stack, so you can get a $100,000 project would generate $20,000 in federal tax credits, and it would also generate $20,000 in state credits. So we have done, since 1990, since this law was first passed, we've done about 200 federal tax credit projects. In fact, we just clipped over our 200th project, so we're a little above that now. And we've done well over 1,000 state tax credit projects. The majority of those tax credit projects on the state were residential in character. I would say probably about 85 to 90% of them have been residential projects, and the rest have been commercial. The 200 federal tax credit projects were income-producing properties in downtowns, and around the state. So those have the benefit of not only fixing up a building, but also generating economic activity once the building opens for the new use. So overall, we estimate that people have, since it's a 20% credit, we estimate that people have spent about $800 million overall since 1990 on working on these buildings, fixing them up. When you rehabilitate a building, one of the great things about historic preservation is that a lot of the work is very local. You're hiring folks who are local. You're hiring the local plumber. You're hiring the local carpenter. And a lot of the building materials that you buy are going to be local, whereas if you built a house, a new housing subdivision, the materials might come from here. They might come from Arkansas. They might even come from China. So the investment that's made is much more, rehabilitation is much more labor intensive and local intensive. So that $800 million is really getting sent directly back into the local and state economy. And people have saved, through tax credits, have saved over $150 million. So just to kind of visualize what $800 million looks like, there's a couple ways to, I like infographics, so I like making them. This is what $800 million would be. And keep in mind, this is just for Colorado, and this is the federal credit has been around for 35 years. And on top of that, there is other states also have credits. Some of them are newer, some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. But there's a lot of economic activity being generated through historic preservation tax credits on a yearly basis. So the federal credit applies to income-producing properties, and that's most commonly a commercial property, but it could also apply to industrial or a rental unit if you have an apartment building that you're planning on renting out, or you're turning a building into apartments and you're going to rent them out. That makes income for you, so it's considered to be income-producing. Industrial, agricultural, things like that would be considered income-producing, in addition to what they normally imagine, offices and stores, which still do make up the bulk of the federal credit projects, but it doesn't mean that it's limited to them. It covers 20% of the costs associated with materials and labor. I'm not sure why that materials is, or materia. Interesting. You never know what these things are going to pop up when you put them on the screen. But it covers materials and labor, and again, historic building renovations tend to be more labor intensive, so that's a good thing that it covers that. And the materials can also be, now these are all historic examples in this slide of people doing, renovating historic materials, but it can also be new materials. Because it's a rehabilitation credit, a lot of times you'll take a building and you'll need to add new things to put it to the new use. So that fire station, they had to buy a bunch of kitchen equipment and safety equipment to accommodate the kitchen. If you were going to turn a building into apartments, you'd have to buy a lot of bathtubs and stoves and things like that for each unit. And because that helps put the building back into service, the expenses that go with that typically qualify for that 20% tax credit on the federal level. So it doesn't just have to be restoring old materials. New materials can also qualify for the credit. Projects have to be done within 24 months, so there is a timetable for these. They want them to turn around fairly quickly. That is a timeline that you can adjust. If you really think at the beginning of the project that you think it's going to take longer than 24 months, you can request a phased project that gives you up to 60 months. And they'll ask you at the start of the project to sort of delineate the phases that you're anticipating. So if you're in a project where there's some limited funding up front, and you think it might take more than a couple of years to finally get it done, you can lay that out at the start of the project and have up to 60 months to complete it. This is an example of how tax credits work. This is the Northern Hotel in Fort Collins, and the upper left photo is how it looked historically. The upper right-hand photo is how it looked about 1990, and it had been burned in a fire, so actually it's in worse shape than it looks because the upper two floors are completely gutted, no walls, in some places no floor, and the second floor uninhabited, and the ground floor a bunch of an odd collection of buildings, but the storefronts had been totally changed. And frankly, it was a little weird. If you had ever lived in Fort Collins at that time and poked your head inside that building, it was a very subdivided, awkwardly divided space, even from a commercial standpoint. So it was renovated in 1999 through 2000. It was $4.5 million in costs. It generated $908,000 in federal and state tax credits. And they renovated the upper floors and turned them into affordable housing, so they were also able to take advantage of a low-income housing tax credit, and they were able to stack that on top of the $908,000 that they had in historic preservation credits. So with a lot of these programs, you can actually take advantage of multiple different programs at once to help build up the amount of credits that you're getting for your investment. The state tax credit, as it stands right now, the one that was passed in 1990, is limited to properties that are more than 50 years old, and they have to be designated. However, there's a broad way of designating them. The federal program requires that you be listed or eligible on the National Register of Historic Places. The state program says that you can be listed on the National Register, but you could also be listed on the Colorado State Register of Historic Properties or a local historic landmark. So many of you guys come from communities that are designated as certified local governments. Colorado has 51 of them now, and these are governments that have local governments, cities and counties, that have passed ordinances that do historic preservation ordinances that do design review and some planning and zoning tweaks to the existing code so that historic properties are protected. And they also have, all certified local governments have the authority to do reviews of state tax credits locally or to designate local properties and local historic districts as historic landmarks. And that designation would qualify a property for this credit. The state credit applies to everybody. So again, it's the same commercial and industrial and things that you would see with the federal credit you can also take with the state. But the state also adds your own private home. If you're renovating your own primary residence, you can claim tax credit. If you happen to own 8 homes, you wanted to renovate home number 7, you could take the tax credit for that as well. So it applies to pretty much any building that meets the requirements of being 50 years old and being designated historic in some manner. The state tax credit applies to it. So right now, again, all the tax credits can be reviewed locally. There are 30 towns and 3 counties that review them locally. The advantage of that for a homeowner or a business owner is that it's a one-stop shop. They can go to their local community. So for example, in the city of Denver, you can go to the Denver Landmark Preservation Commission. Denver is a certified local government. And a Landmark Preservation Commission will review their design review. They can designate your property as a historic building, or they can designate your neighborhood as a historic district. They can do, if it is a historic building, they have some design review on the exterior to make sure that it meets their local standards for preservation. And at the same time, they can do the review for the state tax credits. And since the review for the design review and the review for the tax credits is pretty much the exact same standards, it's pretty much them just saying the same thing twice. This is great, and then again, this is great, and they can sign off on that, and their signature qualifies you for that state tax credit. You don't have to apply separately to the state. The work does have to follow the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. You should probably Google this because that text is really tiny. It is a series of 10 standards. These were created in 1979 by the Park Service to try to define exactly what rehabilitation was. So it is this broad definition of making a building useful again, restoring it, adding new features where you need to. But this kind of further defines exactly what that means. And so these are broad standards that dedicate to try to lay down exactly what a person should do if they're doing a rehabilitation project, including preserving historic materials, avoiding the creation of a false sense of history by adding things that weren't there historically, adding additions that don't fit, or changing out materials if they are repairable. So it's a very broad standard. It's designed to be applicable to as many different projects and many different situations as possible, and so there are some flexibility built into them because of that. I don't know what that slide says. It says work, so I'm going to work. I'm not sure what, I don't know. I'm not sure what that was. Make up your own slide. That works too. I'm going to dive into the new credit now. If we can work past that embarrassing slide. This is House Bill 1311, and it is the Colorado Job Creation and Main Street Revitalization Act of 2014. And again, as with the other two programs, the title really says a lot about what the bill is focused on and what the program is focused on. And in this case, it's creating jobs, revitalizing main streets. It is designed to stimulate economic activity, especially in smaller communities where there's a great need for that. It was signed into law last year. It had bipartisan support. We were really pleased to see that, and the governor supported it. So it pretty much was, it wasn't a unanimous vote, but it was pretty darn close to it in both the House and the Senate going through. So it continues the existing tax credit for residential properties. That really doesn't change very much at all. It's still 20%. There's a cap of $50,000 per property, but that is the same as it is now. The local review can continue. It still applies to buildings that are 50 years old and are locally designated. So really there's not a whole lot of change with the state credit. There's a few tweaks that we made to it to make it a little more usable, but overall, residential credits don't change at all. The biggest change is that there is now a new commercial tax credit for income-producing properties that raises the credit limit from $50,000 to $1 million in state tax credits. And to be able to afford that, because the state has a balanced budget amendment, they have to be careful with the money. What they've done is actually set aside, in the law, agreed to set aside two pools of money that people can draw off of as they claim credits. And that money is set aside every single year so that we know that it's available. And that will be set aside in 16, 17, 18, and 19. That money's already been agreed to. And if the law is extended in 2019, then they will agree to put more money aside for future years. One of the reasons why we wanted to raise the cap, the Union Station is the photo here with this slide. Union Station was an $8.1 million renovation project. So it was huge. And they got $50,000 in tax credits. I take that back. My numbers are wrong. It was a $40.5 million project. $40.5 million to renovate the station, and it was worth $8 million in tax credits, in federal tax credits, which they were able to help knock down their costs, pay back investors, all sorts of things. Their state tax credit under the old law was $50,000 for $40 million worth of work. So we wanted to up it to at least $1 million. I don't think we can really afford to give out $8 million, but at least $1 million makes it a little more worth their while and does attract investment in a project. But we also wanted to take advantage of small properties because not everybody's going to have $40 million lying around. So we used to have the old pool was just $50,000 no matter what. That was great for homeowners. Most homeowners don't have a significant tax liability, so $50,000 is a pretty good number for most people renovating their own home. But for businesses, it was really not worth a lot at all. So we've created two new pools. One is $2.5 million for big projects that are Union Station sized, over $2 million in costs. And one is $2.5 million that's set aside for small projects that are under $2 million in costs with a focus on, hopefully this will be really small projects in smaller towns where you don't have to spend a lot of money, but it makes a big difference. Each of these pools is $2.5 million for 2016, and for 17, 18, and 19, it'll be $5 million each in those pools. The commercial credit increases to 25% for those small projects. Instead of a 20% credit, get a 25% credit. The commercial credit can be sold. That's big. The only other credit in the state that can be sold or transferred freely is the conservation easement, and that does have some limitations on it that have been added over the years. But you can actually sell, if you donate land to a nonprofit, you can take the value of that and sell it to other people. So it's an investment tool. This is the only other credit that I know of that you can actually do that and sell it up front. And there's no real hassle involved with it. The way that the law is written, you want to sell it to somebody, you write to the Department of Economic Development at the state level and you say, I'm selling this credit to so-and-so says, I would like to buy this credit from so-and-so, and the Department of Revenue and the Department of Economic Development take care of everything else. So no muss, no fuss, no big forms to fill out. You can sell them as many times as you want, to as many people as you want. You can use some of it for yourself and trade the rest away. There are no restrictions on that. And even the people who buy your credits from you, if they want to split it up and use some for themselves and give it to still more people down the road, the same process applies. So sometimes you can take that money from a credit and sell those credits up front to a buyer and use that as a down payment, as collateral for a loan, as a cash match for a grant program, or just to get the project kick-started. And that's something that is a great advance over the old credit where you didn't get the credits until you were done with the project. Nonprofit owners can also apply. Up until now, if you didn't have a tax burden, tax credits really weren't any value to you, but because you can sell them up front, nonprofits who own buildings can do a renovation project and they can sell the credits up front, make use of them. And the big thing that we changed, tax credits are now available every year. Some of you have done tax credits in the recent past. There were some times where the state budget was really lean and the Department of Revenue actually blacked out the tax credit, historic preservation tax credit, on the Colorado income tax return and said you can't take it this year because the state's budget grew too little, or the state's revenues grew too little, and that requirement is off, which is great because that creates a lot more certainty. You know that if you get the credit, you can start taking it immediately. The other bonus that we had is that if you are in a disaster area that's been designated by the President of the United States, by the Governor of Colorado, you can claim an additional 5% of credit for up to 6 years after the declaration of disaster. There are currently 31 counties in Colorado that have had a disaster declaration since 2012. We had a lot of fires, a lot of wildfires in 2012 that were statewide emergencies. The governor would declare a disaster area. And then we had the big floods in 2013 that caused flooding up and down the Front Range. So pretty much almost all of Colorado's major metropolitan areas are located within a currently designated disaster area from either 2012, 2013. Really the only exception to that is probably Routt County and Steamboat Springs are not one, and Douglas County and Castle Rock area are also not one. Otherwise, the entire Front Range and most of the Northeast was affected by either the floods or the fires, and a good chunk of the West as well. So again, that's an automatic 5% that's added to the tax credit. So the difference in the new credit is that the commercial one, because there's a pool of money, and the pool of money will constantly be shrinking as more people apply to it, in order to keep track of that really quickly and efficiently, all the tax credits for the commercial program will be reviewed online. So what will happen is the Office of Economic and Development and International Trade, or OEDIT, has a website. It's actually available at advancecolorado.com is the name of the website. That's kind of a catch-all for many of the tax credit programs that they offer. And you would sign in there and log in with a username and a password and basic information about your building. And starting in July, you can actually submit an application, and it would all be online. All the building information, the photographs, the plan of work, your cost sheets would all be submitted through that website, so it logs it in automatically. Then we would review those materials to see if they're complete, see if the project qualifies, it's a historic building and such, and it's done on a first-come, first-served basis to reserve those credits. We do the review of it and make sure that it meets the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. That's a 90-day review period, so it's a quick turnaround. And if it does meet the standards and it meets the other requirements of the program, you would get an email from Office of Economic Development that would say, congratulations, we have reserved X amount of money from the pool specifically for you and your project. And when you finish the project, you just send in the final paperwork and your final costs, and they would issue automatically a tax credit certificate to you that would then be something you could apply to your state income tax. The work does have to begin within 12 months, and there's also a provision that says that you have to continue working on the property and show progress by logging in at least once a year and demonstrating that you are still working on the project. And that's just to keep people from sitting on it. Somebody says, oh, I've got a big project that I'm planning, and it's $1 million in credits, and that takes $1 million out of the pool, and then they don't do anything with it. That's not fair to anybody else. So we want to make sure that people are progressing towards the goal. And if they run into trouble and can't do it anymore, then that money is freed up for somebody else. Again, the residential side is nearly identical, and the tweaks that we made to make it better is that it eliminates that 5-year holding rule. It used to be that you had to own a property for at least 5 years after you took the credit. Now you don't have to do that anymore. Again, you can take it without having to worry about whether the state's revenues grew by a sufficient amount. And in the old days, the old credit was capped at $50,000 per property forever. Now it resets after 10 years. It goes back to zero because we recognize that, one, new people buy a property and they might want to do their own renovations to it, and also that if you took a tax credit 10 years ago, you might need to do something now. Things that were okay 10 years ago are now falling apart and you need to do more work. In the old days, you couldn't do anymore. Now it resets automatically to zero, so you can do, if you're a long-term homeowner, you can keep going back and taking more credits over and over.
Is that the same with the federal tax credit, or does it remain once you access the tax credits you can't reset?
The federal credits are, it's $1 million per property per year. So actually, in theory, you could come back and apply over several years. A Union Station, for example, they wouldn't be able to take all $8 million, but they could have taken perhaps $2 million because it took about 2 years to do that project. So they could have applied twice for $2 million. Now, it is per property per year. So again, using Union Station as an example, they couldn't split their project up into 8 $1 million chunks and apply all 8 at the same time in the hopes of getting them. It would be limited to $1 million per property per year. We anticipate that most smaller buildings aren't going to have that worry, but that's something to keep. That we want to make sure that the pool is available to as many people as possible. Residential properties also benefit from that 5% credit, so it would be a 25% credit for residential properties that are in those areas. And again, the reviews are still done by either the State Historic Preservation Office, which is me, or by the local governments. If the local governments, those 33 local governments that choose to do it, can do the review just like they do now. See if we have anything else. That might be the last slide. In fact, it looks like it is the last slide. It's not going any further. So that is the nuts and bolts of it. Each law, because Colorado likes the sunset laws, most states do, each law, the old state tax credit, was authorized in 10-year chunks, and it was last authorized in 2008, and it actually ran forward a little over 10 years to the end of December 31st, 2019. The new state tax credit law takes effect on July 1st of this year, and it also runs until December 1st, 2019. So we anticipate, since the new law doesn't supersede the old law, it just sits right next to it in the law book, they're both active laws, and you claim one or the other. One advantage of claiming the old credit for the commercial is that if you have a small project that you might think, oh, there's no more money in the pool, or you don't want to apply online, you want to have it reviewed locally, and you know that you're going to get less than $50,000 in credits anyway, it might be worth your while to just go to the local government and ask them to do the review for you for that small kind of commercial project, instead of hustling with everybody else and doing the online application, trying to get it in while there's still money in the pool. There really isn't any advantage of doing the old credit for a residential property because it would come with all those restrictions, and really you don't get any more benefits. So we anticipate that everybody with a residential property will probably apply under the new credit, and the majority of people will probably apply their commercial under the new credit, but there might be some folks who will apply under the old one. Now, after 2019, I don't think the state's going to want to have 2 competing historic preservation tax credits on the roster, so probably only the new one will be reauthorized up until, say, 2029.
Do you have a question?
Oh, we've got a question. Yay. So yeah, the question here is, well, if you can't read it, it's to confirm the management of the tax credits through the Department of Revenue and Department of Economic Development. It's actually 3. The state, History Colorado is the State Historic Preservation Office. The Department of Economic Development and International Trade, or OEDIT, and the Department of Revenue. And if I could spell revenue. The three roles here would be that our office handles the historic side. Does this meet interior standards for rehabilitation? Economic development manages the pool of money, keeps track of it, keeps track of who has what in terms of certificates and who has applied for what. And the Department of Revenue, or RENEW, as I apparently think it is spelled, does the job of sort of being the heavy at the end where they look over things and say, gee, do these numbers match up or not? Because they deal with you when you file your tax return. One of the things about the commercial credit is that to encourage transparency and auditing, they actually do require you to have your expenses certified by an accountant when you submit it. And if your project is over $2 million, that it actually is also audited by a third-party folk. So you can have your accountant do it, sign off on it, and says, yep, this looks like it's okay. And then if it's a really big project, like a Union Station-sized project, they would have somebody audit the finances and audit the expenditures to make sure that everything was fair and on the line. So we wanted to make sure that people, especially for bigger projects, the money was being distributed fairly and it was actually going to, because there's a limited amount, we wanted to make sure that it was going to the right people for the right reasons.
And it looks like there was a second question.
Thank you. The other question is there a need to apply for the credits before the project is started? And you can join in the middle.
And at the end?
It is much tougher to jump in at the end.
Okay.
And the reason why, so if you jump in the middle, you would be asked to document what the building looked like at the start of the project so that they know what you've done up until this point and make sure that work, because that work would also have to meet the standards for rehabilitation, and then what you're planning to do upcoming with the rest of your time on the project. If you join in the end, the challenge is if you join in at the end, then you don't really have the opportunity to make any adjustments to the project. If someone says, gee, I don't think that these windows meet the standards, or I don't think that this HVAC system was installed in a stealthy manner, or something along those lines where they would have questions about whether it met the standards, it would be too late to do anything about it because you've already spent the money and already installed it. So that's particularly true if you had to demolish things in order to make changes to the property. It's very hard to undo those changes. So you can jump in the middle of a project, just that is a challenge for it. And again, you can jump in at the end, but that's also a challenge. The state won't let you do retroactive applications, and again, that goes back to the fact because we have a balanced budget amendment, we have to be careful with how much back credits we can apply. And so with most of the credits that the state offers, going backwards is a tough sell for the folks in the Department of Revenue and in the State House.
Yeah, and I just want to add a comment. Like most savvy developers would identify some of these tax credits in the pre-development work, because as anybody who's developed a property knows, change orders get more expensive and it just gets more complicated. So I just want to echo what Joe was saying. It's probably best to just apply for these credits at the beginning of a project.
Darlene, did that answer your question?
Yes, that works. Thank you.
Okay, great. And now there's another question, it looks like, from the folks in Brush. So the Brush Central School, that's a big one.
That's a neat project, and if you did work on that, the things that would typically not be included would be additions to the property are pretty much never, for any kind of federal or state, are never considered to be part of the project, even if they're required for the building for whatever reason. Maybe you need an elevator, maybe you need to have a second exit, maybe you just need more space. You can do those additions, and they're covered by the Secretary of the Interior standards. 2 of the standards are dedicated specifically to additions, but the work that you spend on those qualify. Soft costs are things like architect and engineering fees and things like that. Those typically don't qualify for the credits. And things like landscaping, if you're doing work on a parking lot or landscaping the grounds of the building, since that's not associated with the building, that typically doesn't qualify for the credit either. But in general, most of the work that you would probably do, if you're going to turn a school into a new use or renovate it, almost all the work that you would do on the inside and the outside would probably qualify for that credit.
Bricks and mortar?
Yeah, bricks and mortar. Again, new materials, old materials. If you're going to change the building's use, put it in a new use, the things that you have to buy to turn it into that new use would generally qualify, especially if they're bolted down. Now, if you opened up a restaurant and you had to buy a bunch of tables, you probably couldn't claim those because in theory, if your restaurant went out of business, you could take the tables away with you really easily. Whereas if you're building a new HVAC system, you're probably not going to pry that out of the building and take it with you when you move. So those costs, the more bolted down the thing is, the more likely it is to be considered real property as opposed to personal property, and so more likely to be claimable for the credit. You definitely can't claim personal property for the credit, only because of the fact that it doesn't stay with the building.
And it sounds like labor would be covered as well, right? So not like labor in terms of architectural fees and stuff, but the labor of people actually going in and fixing up the building and tuck point, all that stuff.
Right. Any money that you have, if you have to pay, and the thing is too, sometimes you'll get some odd fees. If you hire a contractor, he'll say, oh, it's a 10% contingency fee, and he might charge you a dumpster fee and things like that. And those typically are qualified costs because you can't say to your contractor, hey, I'm not paying you to throw stuff in the dumpster, because he has to throw stuff in the dumpster. It's part of the job. He usually brings the dumpster with him even. So those are things that if you were to hire an architect, you probably couldn't claim those costs. But if you hired a contractor and he has fees associated with it, you probably are okay with claiming that as a tax credit because you have no choice in paying it or not. The question of $10,000, $100,000, how much can you sell credits for? They typically go for about 80 cents on the dollar, or on the dollars. So if you had, that would be about 85,000 is about right. And then they would if somebody would turn that around, they would either use the full amount themselves, or they might sell it, if they're a broker, they might sell it to another client at a markup, and they would pocket the difference in the money, and then the new people would. So maybe they might buy it for $80,000, sell it for $90,000, so you get some money, they get some money, and even the person who's buying it at the markup would still be able to save some money on their taxes. There are a lot of buyers of these, in particular out-of-state companies. So just the one example I like to give is that if you have a cell phone, every single person who pays a cell phone bill in Colorado is generating income for one of those cell phone companies. Most of them are out of state, so they don't really have any property in Colorado. They certainly don't have very much historic property in Colorado, but they do have a Colorado state income tax liability because all the money you're paying them is taxable, and they have to pay some of that back to the state at the end of the year. So if they buy your tax credit from you, then they'll knock it down. If they buy it for 90 cents on the dollar, then they'll save 10% on their tax bill, which is pretty good for them. If they can piece these together, it can be significant savings. And of course, you're also saving money because you're getting that upfront money of, say, $80,000.
And OEDIT takes care of the syndication of those, right?
OEDIT just tracks it, so you just tell them that you're doing it, and then they would automatically track it and reassign it in a database so that people know. And they would share that database with the Department of Revenue so that when, say, Verizon Wireless files their taxes and claims X amount of historic preservation tax credits, they can go to the database and track and make sure that those tax credits are available for them to use.
So it looks like Wendy has a question.
So Wendy's question is about repairs and maintenance, and repairs they are generally covered under the new credit. They really weren't under the old credit. But it was a very vague definition of exactly, nobody really defined what repair was or what maintenance was. So there really was no hard and fast rule for that. I think the new credit specifically defines exactly what qualified rehabilitation costs are. The commercial credit is the exact same one that the federal uses in the Treasury Code, or the IRS Code specifically defines it. And the state credit for residential properties has actually written into the law a specific list of interior and exterior activities that you might take that would be eligible for that credit. It's a lot less guesswork under those credits.
So without doing a full rehabilitation project, I mean, taking an old building, turning it into a whole new use, kind of the bigger like Union Station projects or Brush Central School, but you know, doing those repairs and maintenance to an existing building without totally changing use and stuff would still be eligible?
In some cases it would be, and in some cases it wouldn't. Again, under the old law, it was harder to claim just maintenance costs because the legislature, when they passed the law, said, you know, we don't really want to reward people for doing stuff that they're probably going to do anyway. You know, if your paint is failing on your house because paint fails eventually and you want to replace it, you were probably going to do that anyway, whether there was a tax credit or not. And it's just something that has to be done. It's part of owning a house, so why should you get a reward for it? But in other cases, if people were repairing or restoring siding, they had to strip all the paint off, then you also have to paint. But you're not having to paint because the paint is failing. You're having to paint because you just did a renovation project. So it was kind of a confusing, when does it qualify, when does it not? We hope that the new law kind of clears that up by saying, here's what's qualified and here's what doesn't.
So it looks like Melody and everyone, this PowerPoint will be available. We're actually recording it right now. But first, let me scroll back up to the question from
Melody.
Folks in Brush.
So if the limit is $2.5 million for large projects and first come, first serve, and you run out of money, can you apply next year? Well, that's, so if, it depends on, the limit is $2.5 million for, well, the limit isn't, the limit for a project is $2 million. For a small project is $2 million, but you can spend as much as you want. Again, a Union Station at $40 million could come along and take advantage of this credit. They wouldn't be able to claim all the money that they otherwise would be entitled to, but they could claim up to $1 million in credits. They would fall into that large pool of projects that are over $2 million. But it would be $2 million up to $1 zillion. And then the bottom one would be, the minimum I think is $5,000, and it would be up to $2 million for a small project. So if it's first come, first serve, if you're applying for a project, if the pool is out of money, then you are actually automatically placed in line for the next year's allotment. And that has a 2-year, you can stay on the list for up to 2 years without having to reapply for the credit. If you ran out of money, you might be in more of a interesting situation because of the requirement that you do have to proceed on a fairly regular, steady basis towards your final goal of renovating. So if you did get a tax credit allocation and then you ran out of money and the project stopped dead because there was no funding to continue it, you might lose the credit if you couldn't document that you were still progressing towards the final goal. And in that case, money that is reclaimed from credits is fed back into the pool and goes back out again to new applicants for the credit. Let's see. So there's now a question about the application. I'm going to write it out here. Where can you get these application materials? So that is the... Oh.
You missed some of your typing for some reason.
Or bits. I think I am ahead of... That V wants to show up.
Our V is not working. I'm sorry.
Let's try this again. Hey.
It's advancedcolorado.com, and Joe's typing it in right now, so you can copy it
So that's
and paste.
That's your guy, advancedcolorado.com. And then our office is that is the office of the State Historic Preservation Office, and so we also have additional information on the tax credits and how they work through our grants and financial incentives page. Those are two good links for that. Darlene, again, not to get too into the weeds about what's a qualified cost and what's not, but if you look at it as from a broad standpoint of physical materials and labor, things that you have to do to the physical building to get it into shape to be a new use or to continue its existing use, whether it's a residence or a commercial property, materials and labor associated with that would qualify for the credit. So from a broad standpoint, if you are doing physical labor of any kind on a building, provided it's not an addition to the building, doing physical labor, buying things for a building in part of a renovation, restoration, rehabilitation project, those costs would typically qualify not only the materials that you had to buy, but also the labor for the folks who are installing them. And again, that applies to old materials, it applies to new materials, it applies to demolition, it applies to new construction, again, because those are all part of the things that you need to do to put the building into shape. So typically, all those things would qualify.
So I have a question. If you live in an area that is a CLG, whether it's the county or the municipality, can you get the application and more information from them? Should they really know all that stuff, or definitely go to Advanced Colorado?
Well, if you're doing the commercial credit, you have to apply through Advanced Colorado because they are the sole tracking agency for all of the credits, how much has been given out so far, who owns them, who's traded them to whom, and how much left is in the pool. So everybody has to go through that because they need to have, because it's a pool and time is of the essence in terms of knowing how much is left in the pool, it really has to be done by just one organization that can keep track of it in real time so that when you apply, you know if there are any credits left. And they'll include a running total on their webpage of how much money is left at any given point in time. The residential credit, you can still apply locally. Again, it doesn't change at all from the way it is right now, where certified local governments can do the review on their own without anybody else's review, not the state, not the feds, not anybody. State Historic Preservation Tax Credits do the review in-house, sign off on the paperwork, and it qualifies just as much as if our State Historic Preservation officer signed it.
Any questions from folks who don't feel like typing?
I think
Are you
Darlene
guys
had a
already-
question.
Okay.
I think there's another question up there from Darlene.
Oh, did we miss it?
Well, we have the asbestos abatement. And again, materials and labor are all covered. Oh, we've got two more typers.
While those folks are typing, are people thinking of projects that this could be applied to?
Yes.
Yes.
We've got Central School. That's exciting. Oh, do you have Howard's contact? Or I guess that's
you know
me.
what? Yeah, Howard is not Howard. Howard is actually Joe. Howard is our tech person that signed on.
You guys are all, how does Howard know so much about tax credits?
Joe's typing in his information now.
Well, who knows? Maybe he knows a lot about tax credits.
You never know what you know. Thank you, Shauna.
I do have a
see.
question.
Recommendations for finding investors interested in buying tax. That's a tough one. We are trying to get Colorado Preservation, Inc., which is a nonprofit statewide preservation group, to act as sort of a clearinghouse between people who would like to sell tax credits and people who would like to buy them. Because the three folks who do the tax credit program are all state agencies. None of us can hook people up with other people because they're private entities. And so we can't make recommendations. We can't really even it would be tough for us, I think, to even maintain a list of people interested in buying and selling because of the state's rules about not recommending or not playing favorites and things like that. So we are not really able to do that. We're hoping that because Colorado Preservation Inc. is a nonprofit, that they would be able to set up a clearinghouse of information, even if it's just as simple as here's a page full of people who would like to buy credits, and here's a page full of people who would like to sell credits, so that people in each camp can go to the other's page and contact those people by phone or by email or by internet and say, hey, I would like to buy and or sell credits. Let's talk. That's still in the building stages right now, but I think that was probably how we anticipate that that will go, only because it's the most efficient way to do it.
Sounds like someone else on the phone had a question.
Oh, I was just going to be typing. This is Joan. I was just curious, if there's a building that meets the 50-year age, but it will need to be moved and then restored, does that qualify or not?
You know, the moving expenses wouldn't. Probably your only challenge there is that sometimes if you move a building, you can affect its eligibility for designation as a historic building. Because one of the things that, for certain, the National and State Register designations rely in part on the building's, not just its physical integrity, but also things like its setting and its location, to make sure that a person in that area would get the same feel for it. So, for example, a farmhouse that is on a farm has a different feel than a farmhouse where the rest of the property has been filled in as a subdivision and it's just a farmhouse sitting on a standard subdivision lot would look a whole lot different in terms of context. Sometimes when you move buildings, depending on where you move them to, they might have the same context or they might not. And so moving can be a challenge for those kinds of projects because you are potentially affecting whether it would still be eligible for credits once the building is moved. In a lot of cases, what people would probably do is they would wait for you to move the building first, then evaluate at that point in its new location whether it's still qualified for a national or state or local designation. And then at that point, they would proceed with, okay, it looks like you're still eligible for credits because you're still eligible. But they probably wouldn't want to review the project before then because it may not be eligible at the end of the project. The feds also allow you to move buildings, and again, the same criteria applies, that it does have to be National Register eligible, so they would probably want to wait to review the project until after you've moved it. There is a federal 10% credit, which is available for non-historic buildings that are used for commercial purposes, were built prior to 1936, and, as a catch, cannot be moved at all, not ever, not even if they were moved in 1937, can't be moved at all. So it is, the advantage of the federal 10% credit is that because it is a non-historic building, the Secretary of the Interior standards don't apply, the usual review process doesn't apply, it's all about dollars and cents and just keeping things like walls intact. So it is a much simpler process. You can find that on the National Park Service's tax credit website. You can also Google it. It's a 10% historic preservation tax credit. It is a simpler project, but again, it does have some significant limitations. It's not 50 years old. It has to be before 1936. Now, when they passed that law, it was 1986, and so 50 years made sense, but they didn't write 50 years. They wrote 1936, and so it has been that way ever since. And it does have to be a commercial, non-residential, not even apartment buildings, commercial use only for that credit. So it is more limited, but if you have a building in your downtown that has struggled over the years, there's been altered over the years, and there's not a lot of money to do a fix-up, get it into fighting shape, be designated as a historic building, you can sometimes use that 10% credit to at least put a business in there and to encourage some investment in the project by encouraging whoever's doing the work to get at least 10% of their money back when they do it, which is still better than nothing. And sometimes that could be an important tool, especially in smaller towns where you may not have as many buildings listed on the National Register, you may not have that many historic districts, and so your buildings might have been altered over time. So that's a quick way to take advantage of at least some tax credits, especially in smaller communities.
Well, it looks like we are just about out of time, so if you guys have any more questions, Joe, it sounds like you're open to some emails.
Yep, you can reach me at that email address.
Great, and you can always contact us and we can send over his information as well. Thank you so much for being here. I think that was really, really useful, and hopefully we'll encourage some folks to, start promoting that and being sure everyone in their community knows about it.
Thanks. It was great. We got 22 people, which, well, now we're down to 21 people. We had 22 people, which is pretty great. Thank you all for taking your lunch hour to come out and listen to us. And you guys had some really great questions, so thank you.
And this recording will be available on the website in just a couple of days. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.